You wake to the sound of bronze chains shifting against cold marble. The pale dawn light of 120 AD filters through the high windows of a Roman villa on the Palatine Hill, but it brings no warmth. Your limbs ache from the previous night's banquet, where you served wine to senators who discussed you as if you were furniture, a Greek boy worth less than the amphora in your hands, yet costing more than a common citizen would earn in a lifetime. At 16, you understand the terrible calculus of your existence. You are a delicatus, a delicate boy, a living paradox of extreme privilege and profound degradation. Your life is not your own. It is a master's investment, your body a commodity of flesh and bone, purchased, polished, and prepared for a single purpose: to please the Roman elite. This system of sexual slavery began not in the bedchamber, but in the marketplace. The journey to becoming a delicatus started at slave markets like the one on Delos, where a single day could see thousands of human beings sold. Buyers, often wealthy aristocrats or specialized dealers, examined children between the ages of 7 and 14 with the clinical detachment of men appraising livestock. They checked teeth for quality, felt muscle tone for suppleness, and scrutinized skin for unblemished perfection. The highest prices were reserved for boys from Syria and Greece, particularly those with features Romans idealized: large, expressive eyes, full lips, fair, soft skin, and a naturally graceful posture. The slave dealers were masters of enhancement, employing a brutal regimen of grooming to maximize their product's value. Body hair was meticulously plucked with tweezers or sloughed off with painful pumice stones. Complexives of white lead for a pale complexion, antimony to line the eyes, and vermilion for the lips were applied daily. They were taught a specific, fluid walk and subtle gestures that suggested availability while maintaining an air of reluctant innocence, a performance of seduction crafted by others for an audience of one. Once purchased, the boy was thrust into a world of jarring contradictions. Within the vast domus of a Roman noble, he might wear fine silk while other slaves wore rough tunics, dine on delicacies while others subsisted on coarse bread, and sleep on a pallet near his master's bed, while others crowded into cold subterranean cells. Yet this privileged position was the sharp edge of the blade. His elevation above other slaves made him a target for their resentment, and his proximity to the master made him absolutely, terrifyingly available. The Roman concept of dominica potestas, the master's power, was absolute. A slave had no legal personhood, he was property, and his body was entirely at the disposal of his owner. Concepts of consent, age of maturity, or personal autonomy simply did not apply in the relationship between master and slave. This legal and social framework normalized what we would now recognize as systematic pedophilia and rape, dressing it in the language of domesticity and tradition. The most infamous, though extreme, example of this absolute power is the tragic story of Sporus, as documented by historians like Suetonius. Emperor Nero, after kicking his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death in 65 AD, encountered a young slave boy who bore a striking resemblance to her. In an act of grotesque possession, Nero had the boy, Sporus, castrated, an operation that was technically illegal under Roman law but which emperors blithely ignored. He then forced Sporus to dress in the dead empress's robes, installed him in her apartments, and went through a formal marriage ceremony, complete with a dowry and wedding hymns. The Roman public was commanded to address this traumatized teenage boy as Empress and Augusta. Sporus's ordeal did not end with Nero's death. He was passed as a trophy between successive powerful men: the Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus, then Emperor Otho. When Vitellius took power, he planned to have Sporus brutally raped on stage as part of a public spectacle. To avoid this final theatrical humiliation, Sporus took his own life. He was likely no older than 21. His story serves as a stark monument to the ultimate destination of the delicatus system, the complete annihilation of a human being's identity for the whims of power. While most delicati did not suffer such a spectacularly public fate, their daily reality contained its own catalogue of normalized horrors. Their value was intrinsically tied to their youth and beauty, both fleeting assets. The moment a boy's voice began to deepen, his jawline hardened, or body hair grew back coarser, his value plummeted. This created a pervasive ticking clock anxiety that defined their short careers. Masters, determined to protect their expensive investments, employed drastic measures to stall the onset of manhood. Physicians like Soranus of Ephesus recommended treatments involving specific herbs, frequent bloodletting to maintain soft skin, and harsh, lime-based depilatory creams that burned the skin to prevent hair growth. These were not acts of care, but of maintenance, akin to polishing silver or oiling a hinge. The boy was a living object, and his preservation was a matter of economic prudence. Thus, from the auction block to the gilded villa, the delicatus was manufactured. He was stripped of his past identity, groomed into a perfect object of desire, and inserted into a household where his position was both envied and perilous. He was a walking testament to his master's wealth and taste, yet he himself was afforded no legal rights, no bodily autonomy, and no future beyond the whims of the man who owned him. The system was engineered to break him not with the lash alone, but with a devastating combination of luxury and terror, privilege and profound violation, creating a gilded cage from which there was seldom any true escape. Life for a delicatus within the Roman household was a meticulously staged performance, a constant ballet of availability and refinement where every gesture, word, and note of music was choreographed to please his master. His existence was a paradox of intense visibility and profound invisibility. He was constantly on display as a living symbol of wealth, yet his own desires and humanity were entirely erased. The gilded cage was not one of idleness, but of relentless training and maintenance, all designed to craft the perfect companion from a broken boy. From the moment of his purchase, a rigorous program of education began. This was not for his own enlightenment, but to equip him as a sophisticated accessory. He was taught to dance with fluid grace, to sing in a voice kept artificially high, and to play instruments like the lyre or flute. Tutors drilled him in Greek and Latin literature, forcing him to memorize passages from Homer, Virgil, and Ovid for recitation at banquets. The goal was witty, intellectual conversation. He needed to be able to discuss Stoic philosophy or recite a line of Catullus at a moment's notice, but only when prompted. His mind was being furnished like a beautiful room in his master's house, elegant, impressive, but ultimately serving another's purpose. As the philosopher Plutarch noted with detached curiosity, it was an unusual extravagance to have a concubine who could debate ethics while pouring wine, highlighting that this intellectual training was just another layer of ornamentation. This intellectual grooming was matched by an exhaustive regime of physical preservation that consumed hours each day. His body was not his own temple, but his master's prized sculpture. Each morning began with the application of cosmetics, white lead powder to achieve a fashionably pale complexion, a dangerous substance that could lead to poisoning over time, antimony to darken and define the eyes, and red ochre, or vermilion, to color the lips. His hair was styled in elaborate, often effeminate fashions that would be scorned on a freeborn Roman man but were considered appropriate for a slave of his station. Perfumes imported at great cost from Arabia and India were applied to his skin and clothing, marking him as a luxury object by scent alone. His diet was strictly controlled. Some masters enforced near starvation to maintain a slender, youthful figure, while others force-fed their boys rich foods to create a plumpness associated with prosperity and indulgence. His primary stage was the Roman banquet, the scena. Here, the delicatus was a central part of the spectacle. As described by poets like Martial and Petronius, he would stand for hours, often nude or clad in sheer silks, behind his master's dining couch. His duties were a demeaning blend of the domestic and the erotic, fanning the guests, offering silver bowls of perfumed water for hand washing, and pouring wine. He was expected to be a silent, beautiful presence until called upon to recite poetry or play a tune. In some of the most debauched gatherings, he might be passed between guests like a wine cup, his body treated as communal property. His presence was a clear, unspoken demonstration of his master's wealth and power. Maintaining such a boy was exorbitantly expensive. The cost of his silks, perfumes, tutors, and special food far exceeded the upkeep of a dozen agricultural slaves. He was therefore the ultimate status symbol, proof that his master possessed not just wealth, but the refined taste to spend it on such an exquisite and useless luxury. Beyond the banquet hall, his visibility continued. He accompanied his master to the public baths, carrying his strigil and oil flask, waiting nude in the steamy caldarium as a testament to his owner's discerning taste. At the theatre or games, he would sit at his master's feet rather than in a seat, a living possession on display for the crowd. Even religious festivals offered no respite. During the Saturnalia, a time of role reversal when ordinary slaves could mock their masters, the delicatus often faced increased demands and humiliation as the parties grew wilder. The Floralia, dedicated to the goddess Flora, featured theatrical performances that sometimes compelled him to dance nude before leering audiences. Yet, within this oppressive structure, the delicatus was forced to develop a complex psychological survival strategy. He had to learn to read his master's moods with exquisite sensitivity, to know when to speak wittily when to offer a silent, sympathetic glance, and when to make himself scarce. He was navigating a minefield where a spilled goblet of wine, a poorly timed laugh, or a moment of perceived insolence could result in a beating, sale to a brothel, or worse. Some learned to manipulate these dynamics, using flattery and feigned affection to gain small advantages or fleeting protections. They formed strategic alliances with powerful patrons or cultivated relationships with other slaves for emotional support, creating a fragile network of survival within the opulent prison. His life was a performance of devotion, a mask of contentment he was forced to wear every waking moment, all while knowing that his value, and therefore his safety, was as perishable as the flowers woven into his hair. Beneath the silks and cosmetics, the life of a delicatus was one of profound and systematic physical and psychological destruction. His body was a battlefield, subjected to chronic ailments, intentional violence, and the slow erosion of his spirit. The gilded cage was not just a prison of the mind, but a crucible of suffering, where the relentless demands of his role left indelible scars, both seen and unseen. For every moment of performed affection, there were hours of pain. For every poetic verse recited, there was a silent scream of resistance, or the desperate planning of an escape that was almost always impossible. The medical reality for these boys was grim. The renowned physician Galen, who treated Rome's elite, documented chronic conditions that plagued the delicati. He described treatments for what modern medicine would recognize as sexually transmitted infections, which he attributed to an excess humidity of temperament. Anal fissures, rectal prolapse, and chronic pelvic pain were common enough that medical texts included specific, often brutal remedies. Surgical procedures to repair tissue damage appear in the writings of Cornelius Celsus, suggesting a demand for restoring a body worn down by repeated abuse. Pain management was primitive and addictive, relying on wine and opium preparations, which created dependencies that masters could then exploit for further control. The very cosmetics that defined their existence were often toxic. The white lead powder used for a pale complexion could cause lead poisoning, leading to neurological damage, abdominal pain, and a slow, degenerative decline. Their bodies, meticulously curated for beauty, were being systematically destroyed from the inside out. This physical suffering was compounded by pervasive psychological trauma. Roman writers like Seneca the Younger noted matter-of-factly that wise masters restricted a delicatus's access to ropes and sharp objects, a chilling acknowledgement of the high suicide rates among this particular class of slave. What Romans termed a melancholic disposition, or nervous exhaustion, we would recognize today as severe depression, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and profound anxiety. These young men lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, forced to anticipate their masters' desires while navigating the ever-present threat of violence from their owners, the jealousy of their masters' wives, and the resentment of other slaves. The poet Juvenal satirized masters who fell in love with their pueri, not out of sympathy for the slave, but because he found the emotional attachment to a piece of property ridiculous. This societal attitude denied the victim any legitimate claim to their own emotional experience, compounding their isolation. In the face of such overwhelming oppression, resistance took many forms, most of them subtle and desperate. Feigned illness was a common and temporary reprieve. Some engaged in self-sabotage, deliberately gaining weight, scarring their skin with acid or rough stones, or neglecting their grooming to make themselves less desirable and reduce their market value, a dangerous gamble that often resulted in severe punishment. Others practiced a form of psychological withdrawal, dissociating during acts of abuse, retreating into an inner world where their master's power could not reach them. More direct resistance was rare and perilous. There are accounts of concubines poisoning their masters, like the rumor that Emperor Claudius's delicatus, Helotus, administered the fatal mushrooms. Whether true or not, such stories speak to a deep-seated fear among the Roman elite of the intimate vengeance of those they abused. The ultimate resistance was suicide, a final, tragic act of reclaiming control over a body that had never been their own. When a delicatus began to age, his fate was almost always bleak. The onset of manhood, a deepening voice, the coarsening of features, the growth of a beard, signaled the end of his usefulness in his primary role. The master who had once lavished him with silks and delicacies now faced a depreciated asset. For the fortunate few, there was a transition to another household role. A boy educated in rhetoric might become a secretary. One skilled with numbers could be made an accountant. These were the exceptions. For the majority, the end of their youth meant a terrifying descent into a much harsher tier of slavery. Many were sold to brothels, lupanaria, where they were used until disease or death took them. Others were dispatched to the agricultural latifundia to break their backs in the fields, or worse, to the mines, where life expectancy was measured in months. The promise of manumission was often a hollow one. Freedom papers frequently included clauses that bound the freedman to continued sexual service to his former master, exchanging one form of bondage for another. Even if granted unconditional freedom, the social stigma of having been a delicatus followed a man for life, making integration into respectable society nearly impossible. His past was a brand that could not be erased. The story of the delicatus is therefore one of systematic consumption. He was a human resource, mined for his youth and beauty until the resource was exhausted and then discarded. The care put into his training and maintenance was not born of compassion, but of the same logic that motivates a man to polish a fine weapon or maintain a valuable racehorse. His body and mind bore the full cost of this exploitation, a cost documented in medical texts, whispered about in poetry, and etched into the bones found in unmarked graves. His suffering was the dark, unspoken foundation upon which the glittering world of Roman elite leisure was built, a testament to the brutal reality that for some, the most beautiful cages have the deadliest locks. The story of the delicatus does not end with the fall of Rome. It echoes through the centuries, forcing us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the normalization of atrocity and the persistent patterns of exploitation that continue to shape our world. Reconstructing their lives requires piecing together an archive of absence, a collection of biased accounts, fragmented archaeological evidence, and silent testimonies that together reveal a system of brutality hiding in plain sight. Understanding this history is not an academic exercise. It is a crucial lens through which to examine the ongoing commodification of human beings, particularly children, in our own time. Our knowledge of the delicatus is inherently filtered and flawed. The primary sources, the poets, historians, and moralists, were all elite Roman men who wrote from within the system they described. When the poet Statius composed a consolation for his friend Flavius Ursus on the death of his young delicatus, he compared the boy to the beautiful youth Hyacinthus, tragically killed by a god. The narrative is one of romantic loss, effectively erasing the reality of ownership and abuse. Similarly, when Seneca advises moderation in the use of slaves, he does not question the institution itself, but rather the master's lack of self-control. These sources provide the what, but rarely the how it felt. Archaeological evidence fills some gaps, but also presents its own silence. The skeletal remains of young males from the 1st and 2nd centuries, excavated from mass slave graves near Roman villas, show distinct signs of chronic stress, specific physical traumas, and evidence of malnutrition, despite proximity to plenty hints of the psychological and physical toll of their existence. Graffiti from Pompeii includes brief, heartbreaking scrawls that might be names or tallies, the faintest whispers of personhood from those denied a voice. As the Roman Empire evolved, so too did the legal and social frameworks around slavery, though change was glacial and often superficial. Emperor Constantine's laws in the 4th century AD, influenced by growing Christian sentiment, prohibited the prostitution of children, but contained loopholes that exempted those already enslaved. Justinian's codes in the 6th century went further, explicitly banning the sexual use of child slaves, but enforcement remained sporadic. The real shift was often one of rhetoric rather than practice. Church fathers like Street, Augustine wrote extensively about the sin of lust and the keeping of concubines, yet acknowledged his own participation in such arrangements before his conversion. The system was so deeply embedded in the economic and social fabric of the ancient world that even a revolutionary ideology like Christianity could only slowly and incompletely chip away at its foundations. The most critical reason to study this history, however, is its stark and unsettling relevance. The specific term delicatus may be ancient, but the dynamics that created and sustained this system are terrifyingly modern. Today, we have different names for it: human trafficking, child sexual exploitation, the commercial sexual exploitation of children, CSEC. The underlying mechanics are identical. Then, as now, economic desperation drives the supply. Roman slave traders preyed on war captives, abandoned children, and the impoverished. Today, traffickers target children from impoverished regions, broken homes, and marginalized communities. The Roman buyer at the Delos market, clinically assessing a child's physical attributes, finds his counterpart in the modern sex tourist or the online predator browsing illicit websites. The legal vulnerabilities also persist. A Roman slave was res, a thing, with no legal standing to refuse his master. Today, victims of trafficking are often undocumented immigrants, runaways, or individuals coerced through debt and threats, living in the shadows of the legal system and terrified of authorities. The Roman social normalization, where the presence of a delicatus at a banquet was a sign of status, is mirrored in cultures and contexts, where the sexual exploitation of children is tacitly accepted or willfully ignored due to corruption or entrenched power structures. The technology has changed. The internet now facilitates this exploitation on a global scale, but the fundamental transaction, the reduction of a human being to a commodity for sexual pleasure, remains the same. Confronting the history of the delicatus therefore compels us to look in the mirror. It challenges the comfortable notion that such brutality is confined to the distant, uncivilized past. The Roman elite did not see themselves as monsters. They saw their actions as normal, traditional, and legally sanctioned. This is the most insidious aspect of systemic evil, its ability to masquerade as normalcy. By studying how a society constructs frameworks to justify the unjustifiable, we become better equipped to identify those same patterns in our own time. The forgotten boys of Rome, whose names are mostly lost to history, become a silent chorus urging vigilance. Their suffering demands that we question our own assumptions, scrutinize our own systems, and recognize that the fight against the commodification of human bodies is not a relic of history, but a continuous and urgent moral imperative. The gilded cages are still being built, they just have different facades. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but necessary journey into the shadows of history. If this exploration of the past has resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content that seeks to uncover history's hidden truths. Understanding where we have been is the first step toward building a more just future.